There are disappearances that haunt a community for generations, cases where the absence of answers becomes a kind of living ghost. In November 1989, in a town so small that everyone knew everyone's name, a young woman went for a run and never came home. She left behind tire tracks and gravel, a loyal dog waiting at a roadside, and a family frozen in the moment between hope and horror. Her name was Amanda Teresa Stavik, though everyone called her Mandy. She was 18 years old, home from college for Thanksgiving, full of dreams about teaching children and changing the world. On a cold, gray afternoon, she laced up her running shoes and disappeared into the rural roads of Whatcom County, Washington, a place where neighbors trusted neighbors, where doors stayed unlocked, and where violence felt like something that happened somewhere else. For 3 days, her family prayed she was lost, injured, waiting to be found. But when the Nooksack River gave up her body, waterlogged and broken, it delivered not answers but a deeper darkness. And for nearly 3 decades, that darkness will remain unbroken. But after years of silence, a single clue would shatter everything. Before I tell you what happened, comment your country and time below. The town of Acme, Washington, sits in the shadow of Mount Baker, tucked into the northwest corner of the state, where forests grow thick and rivers run cold even in summer. In 1989, it was the kind of place where children rode bikes without helmets, where high school football games were Friday night religion, and where a stranger's face was noticed immediately. The population hovered around 200 souls. Everyone knew the Stavik. Mandy was her golden child, not in the superficial sense, but in the way she moved through the world with genuine warmth. She had blonde hair that caught the light, a smile that disarmed strangers, and a laugh that her younger brother could identify from 3 rooms away. She was a freshman at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, studying to become an elementary school teacher. Her professors noted her patience, her creativity in lesson planning, her ability to connect with struggling students. She wrote letters home weekly, decorated with hand-drawn flowers in the margin. Thanksgiving 1989 arrived with a particular stillness of the Pacific Northwest in late November, low clouds pressing down like a gray ceiling. The smell with smoke and wet earth, the kind of cold that settles in the bone. The Stavik family celebrated on Thursday the 23rd. Turkey, stuffing, pumpkin pie made from her Mother Mary's handwritten recipe. Mandy wore an oversized sweater and helped wash dishes while her father, Tom, fell asleep watching football. It was ordinary. It was perfect. It was the last normal day they would ever know. Friday, November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving. A rest day for most of America. Belly still full. Plans lazy and unstructured. Mandy woke late, patted downstairs in socks, poured herself coffee. She'd been a runner since high school, not competitive, but dedicated. Running cleared her mind, she'd told friends. It was meditation in motion. Even during college, she maintained the habit, logging miles around campus, always with music or just the rhythm of her breath. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, she changed into running clothes, dark leggings, a purple windbreaker, wore Nikes with the tread flattening at the heel. She pulled her hair into a ponytail. Her German shepherd, Kyra, danced at the door, sensing the routine. Kyra was Mandy's shadow, protective, intelligent, trained to stay close during runs along rural roads where cars occasionally appeared around blind curves. Mary Stavik watched from the kitchen window as Mandy stretched against the porch railing, one leg extended, then the other. A mother's casual surveillance. No premonition attached. Mandy waved. Mary waved back. The door closed. Footsteps crunched on gravel. And then Mandy Stavik jogged down the driveway, turned left onto Strand Road, and ran into a void so absolute it would swallow 28 years. Her usual route followed a 5-mile loop through farmland and forest. Strand Road to North Pass Road, then looping back through acreage owned by families she'd known since childhood. The roads were narrow, unpaved in sections, bordered by Douglas firs and western red cedars that seemed to absorb sound. In November, daylight dies early. By 3:30, the light would begin its retreat. By 4:30, shadows would blur into darkness. When Mandy wasn't home by 4 o'clock, Mary felt the first flicker of concern, faint, dismissible. Traffic. Maybe a longer route. By 5 o'clock, the flicker became a flame. By 6, when full darkness had fallen and there was still no sign of her daughter, Mary called Tom. They drove the route slowly, headlights sweeping empty road, calling Mandy's name into the wind. Nothing, no response, just a whisper of trees and the distant sound of the Nooksack River moving through the darkness. At 7:30, they called the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. The initial response was measured, procedural. 18-year-old college student, home for the holiday, went for a run, missing for 5 hours. No history of running away, no boyfriend drama. no mental health red flag. But also, and this carried weight in 1989, no cell phone, no way to call for help if she twisted an ankle or encountered trouble. The dispatcher logged the call. A deputy was dispatched. By midnight, the search had expanded. Volunteers materialized from community, neighbors, classmates home for Thanksgiving, members of the volunteer fire department. They formed lines, walked the roads with flashlight, called Mandy's name until their voices went hoarse. The temperature dropped toward freezing. Frost formed on windshield. The darkness felt malicious, withholding. Saturday brought daylight and more searchers. Over 100 people combing field, peering into drainage ditches, pushing through underbrush. Helicopters from the Coast Guard flew grid patterns overhead. Thermal imaging cameras searching for heat signatures. Bloodhounds were brought in, given Mandy's scent from a worn t-shirt. The dogs followed a trail down Strand Road, then lost it near a turnoff where the gravel met pavement, and then someone found Kyra. The German Shepherd was discovered Saturday afternoon, wandering along North Pass Road, about 2 miles from the Stavik home. She was muddy, exhausted, her paws cut and bleeding, but she was alive. She hadn't been hit by a car. She hadn't been attacked. She'd simply been separated from Mandy, left behind, or escaped from something. The detailed, chilled investigator. Kyra was loyal to the point of stubbornness. She didn't abandon Mandy. Something had forced them apart. Sunday, the third day, the Nooksack River had been running high with November rain. Its current swift and cold enough to stop a heart in minute. Search teams focused on the riverbanks, the theory forming unspoken. If Mandy had fallen, been swept away, the river might have carried her miles downstream. At 11:15 Sunday morning, a searcher wading through shallow water near the Y Road Bridge saw something pale against the dark rocks. At first, he thought it was debris, a tarp, a piece of clothing snagged on a root. He moved closer. The pale shape had a form, a human form. Mandy Stavik had been found. Her body was partially submerged, caught in the current's edge where the river bent and slowed. She was still wearing her purple windbreaker and running shoes. The autopsy would later reveal that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and drowned, though whether she was alive when she entered the water remained a medical ambiguity. A horror the family would replay endlessly in their mind. The medical examiner estimated she had been in the water approximately 3 days. Since Friday, since the moment she vanished. The investigation that followed moved with the technology and methodology of 1989. Limited, clumsy compared to modern standards, but earnest. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They processed the scene where Mandy's body was recovered, photographed tire tracks near a turnoff on North Pass Road, collected fiber evidence, and samples that seemed promising but led nowhere. They looked at transients, sex offenders in surrounding counties, anyone with a history of violence against women. But the forensic science of the era had limitations. DNA analysis existed, but it was expensive, slow, and required large samples. The biological evidence collected from Mandy's body was preserved, cataloged, and stored, a kind of faith deposit, a bet on future technology. Weeks became months. The leads dried up. The media attention faded. The yellow police tape came down. Acme returned to its rhythms, but the town was different now, quieter, warier. People locked their doors. Parents didn't let children wander. The murder of Mandy Stavik had introduced a fundamental rupture, the knowledge that evil could live among them, hidden behind familiar faces. By the end of 1990, the case was cold, not officially closed, but dormant. The files sat in boxes in the sheriff's office basement. The evidence sat in a freezer, waiting for a future that might never arrive. For the Stavik family, there was no moving forward. There was only the permanent present tense of grief. Grief is a country without borders, a place you enter suddenly and can never fully leave. For Tom and Mary Stavik, and for Mandy's younger brother and sister, the years after 1989 unfolded in a kind of terrible suspension. Life continued in the mechanical sense. Bills were paid, meals were cooked, seasons changed. But the emotional architecture of their family had collapsed, and no amount of time could rebuild it. Mary Stavik kept Mandy's bedroom exactly as she'd left it. The twin bed made with a floral comforter, the bulletin board covered with photos of friends, dried corsages from dances, acceptance letters from colleges, textbooks still stacked on the desk, waiting for a student who would never return. On Mandy's birthday each year, Mary would bake a cake, German chocolate, her daughter's favorite, and place it on the kitchen table with a single candle. She would light it and let it burn down to a puddle of wax, a ritual of remembrance, a defiance against forgetting. Tom Stavik threw himself into work, seeking refuge in the physical exhaustion of long days. But friends noticed a change, how his smile never quite reached his eyes anymore, how he'd go silent in the middle of conversations, his gaze distant. He'd been the kind of father who coached Little League and built tree houses. After Mandy's death, he became a man who moved through the world carefully, as if the ground might open beneath him at any moment. The community of Acme struggled with its own collective trauma. In the immediate aftermath, there have been vigils, fundraisers, a scholarship established in Mandy's name. But as years passed, the intensity of public mourning faded into a kind of ambient sadness. People still thought about Mandy, saw her ghost jogging along Strand Road on gray November afternoon, but they stopped talking about it as much, not from callousness, but from the exhaustion of carrying unresolved grief. There's a particular cruelty in unsolved cases. They deny closure, yes, but they also impose a perpetual state of vigilance. Every time a strange car appeared in town, every time someone noticed a new face at the grocery store, the question surfaced. Could that be him? The killer had walked among them, maybe still did. That knowledge poisoned the easy trust that had once defined small-town life. For the investigators who'd worked the case initially, Mandy's murder became a professional haunting. Detective Ken Gates, who'd been one of the lead investigators, kept the case files in his office long after they'd been officially archived. He'd pull them out periodically, review the evidence, look for patterns he might have missed. When he retired in 1998, he passed the files to a younger detective with a simple instruction: don't let her be forgotten. But the reality was stark. Without new evidence, without a witness coming forward, without a technological breakthrough, the case had nowhere to go. The biological samples collected in 1989 sat in storage, their potential locked behind the limitations of forensic science. DNA analysis had advanced significantly through the 1990s, becoming faster, more sensitive, requiring smaller samples. But there was a resource problem. Cold cases competed with active investigations for limited lab time and budget. Mandy's case was tragic, but it was also one file among thousands. The turn of the millennium came and went. The Stavik family aged. Mandy's younger siblings graduated from high school, went to college, built lives shaped by the permanent absence of their sister. They carried her with them, mentioned her in wedding toasts, named daughters after her, visited her grave on holidays. But they also learned to live with the weight. The way you learn to live with a chronic pain that never fully subsides but becomes part of your baseline existence. In Acme, children who'd been toddlers when Mandy died grew into teenagers who knew her only as a local legend. The pretty blonde girl whose face appeared on a memorial poster in the library, whose death parents invoked as a warning about stranger danger. The specificity of her humanity faded for those who hadn't known her. She became a symbol, an abstraction. This is what time does to tragedy when justice doesn't intervene. It smooths the edges, reduces the particular to the general. Mary Stavik gave occasional interviews to local reporters on the anniversary of Mandy's death. She always said the same thing. She believed the killer would be caught eventually. She forgave him in the Christian sense, but still wanted him held accountable. She would never stop hoping for answers. The reporters would write their articles. Family still seeks justice 10 years later. Acme murder remains unsolved after 15 years, and the stories would run on slow news days, generating brief public attention before fading again. But something was changing in the broader world of criminal investigation. DNA technology was evolving rapidly. What had required a blood sample the size of a quarter in 1989 could now be performed with a few cells from a cigarette. But databases were being built, connecting evidence across jurisdictions. And a new generation of cold case investigators, trained in modern forensics, was beginning to review old files with fresh eyes and new tools. In 2003, 14 years after Mandy's death, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office assigned a detective named Jim Scharf to review unsolved cases. Scharf was methodical, patient, and relatively new to the department, which many lacked emotional baggage that sometimes prevents fresh perspective. When he pulled Mandy Stavik's file, he was struck by two things: the brutality of the crime and the quality of the physical evidence that had been preserved. Scharf sent the biological samples to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab with a request for DNA analysis using modern techniques. Months passed. Then, in early 2004, the lab returned results. They'd successfully developed a full DNA profile of the suspect. It was male, it was unique, and it could be compared against combined DNA index system CODIS, the national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders. The profile was entered into CODI. No match. Whoever had killed Mandy Stavik had either never been arrested for a serious crime or had been arrested before DNA collection became standard. It was a significant step forward. They now knew the biological identity of the killer, but it was also a dead end. Without a suspect to compare against, the profile was just data. Scharf didn't give up. He began working through the original witness statement, re-interviewing people who'd been teenagers in 1989 and were now adults. He created a list of potential suspects, men who'd been in the area, who'd had histories of violence or sexual aggression, who'd raised suspicion during the initial investigation. He requested DNA samples, sometimes through voluntary submission, sometimes through court order. One by one, he eliminated names. None matched. Years passed. The Staviks entered their third decade of waiting. Tom's health began to decline. Heart problems that doctors attributed partly to chronic stress. Mary's hair went fully white. She still kept Mandy's room preserved, though she'd stopped baking birthday cakes, the ritual having lost its power to comfort. In the broader culture, true crime was experiencing a renaissance. Podcasts and documentary series brought renewed attention to cold cases. Genetic genealogy, using DNA profiles to build family trees and identify suspects through distant relatives, was beginning to show remarkable results. The Golden State Killer was identified in 2018 through this method, breaking a case that had been cold for 4 decades. The technique sparked hope in cold case units across the country. Detective Scharf, still working Mandy's case intermittently while juggling active investigations, took notice. Could genetic genealogy work for Mandy? It required a different approach. Instead of comparing the suspect's DNA directly to a database of criminals, you uploaded the profile to public genealogy websites where ordinary people had submitted their DNA to trace their ancestry. If the suspect had distant cousins in the database, you could build a family tree backward and forward in time, narrowing down potential suspects through conventional detective work. But there was a problem. The technique was new, expensive, and time-consuming. It required approval from the sheriff's office and funding that cold cases rarely received. Scharf wrote proposals, made presentations, called in favors. He emphasized not just a Stavik case, but the precedent it could set, the message it would send at Whatcom County. Didn't forget its victims. That time and budget constraints wouldn't protect killers forever. In 2017, nearly 28 years after Mandy's death, the sheriff's office approved funding for genetic genealogy analysis. The suspect's DNA profile was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in advanced forensic analysis. The team there uploaded the profile to GeneMatch, a public genealogy database, and then they waited. Within weeks, they had hits, distant genetic matches, third and fourth cousins sharing small segment of DNA with the suspect. The genealogists began building family trees, tracing lineages back through generations of marriages, births, death. It was painstaking work, requiring access to census records, obituaries, birth certificate, the paper trail of ordinary lives. Slowly, the tree took shape, and it pointed to Acme, Washington. The genealogy analysis identified several family lines that converged in Whatcom County. When the results were handed back to Detective Scharf, he felt the cold electricity of recognition. The families identified were local families, old families whose names appeared on the original witness list from 1989. But then, after years of silence, something changed. On May 24th, 2018, Detective Scharf knocked on a door in Acme and asked a man if he'd be willing to provide a DNA sample to help an investigation. The man agreed. His name was Timothy Bass, and when his DNA came back from the lab 2 weeks later, it was a perfect match to the profile from Mandy Stavik's body. Tim Bass was 51 years old when detectives came knocking. He lived in Acme, had lived there his entire life, in a modest house on a quiet street. He worked at the Franz Bakery, a large commercial bakery, where he'd been employed for over 2 decades. He was married, a father, a man so ordinary in appearance and demeanor that neighbors would later struggle to reconcile him with the monster investigators described. But the most chilling detail wasn't his ordinary, it was his proximity to the victim. In 1989, Tim Bass had been 21 years old. He graduated from Whatcom High School just a few years before Mandy. They'd known each other, not well. He was 3 years older, moved in different circles, but they'd existed in the same small-town ecosystem. He'd been at that Thanksgiving Day turkey trot in previous year. He'd driven the same road she ran. He'd been interviewed during the initial investigation in 1989, volunteered information, and been eliminated as a suspect because there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime and no apparent motive. For 28 years, Tim Bass had continued living in Acme. He'd watched the vigils, seen the memorial posters, passed Mary Stavik in the grocery store. He'd raised children who played in the same parks where Mandy had played. He'd existed as a fully integrated member of the community while carrying the knowledge of what he'd done. When Detective Scharf examined the original 1989 investigation files with Bass's name highlighted, a pattern emerged. Bass had been pulled over near the area where Mandy's body was found shortly after her disappearance for a minor traffic violation. He'd seemed nervous, according to the deputy's note, but that wasn't unusual. People get nervous around police. He'd offered information about seeing Mandy jogging earlier that day, claimed he'd been driving around looking at property. Nothing about the encounter had raised sufficient alarm to pursue him further. The genetic genealogy had identified him through a complex web of family connections. Bass's family tree included relatives who'd submitted their DNA to Ancestry website, third cousins he'd likely never met, whose innocent curiosity about their heritage heritage had inadvertently provided a link to a murderer. The genealogists had narrowed the suspect pool to a handful of men in the right age range living in Whatcom County. Base's name emerged as the strongest candidate based on his proximity to the crime and the fact that he'd been in the area at the time. The DNA sample Base provided in May 2018, collected from a discarded soda cup after he'd been approached by an undercover officer posing as a market researcher, was definitive. The statistical probability that someone other than Timothy Base had assaulted Mandy Stavik was approximately 1 in 1 trillion. It was as close to certainty as forensic science could provide. On May 24th, 2018, Timothy Base was arrested at his workplace. The arrest was captured on security cameras, Base being let out in handcuffs, confusion, and then resignation crossing his face. His co-workers watched in shock. His wife told reporters she couldn't believe it, that there must be a mistake. His children, now adults, faced the impossible task of reconciling their father with the accusation. The arrest sent shockwaves through Acme. For nearly 3 decades, the community had lived with the specter of an unknown killer, imagining him as a transient, an outsider, someone who'd passed through and disappeared. The revelation they'd been there all along, shopping at the same store, pumping gas at the same station, possibly sitting near them at church, was profoundly destabilized. Detective Scharf held a press conference the day after the arrest. He stood beside the sheriff, his voice steady but emotional. "Today, we can tell the Stavik family that we know who killed Mandy. We can tell the community that this case was never forgotten. And we can tell other families with missing loved ones that advances in science mean we can solve cases that once seemed impossible." When Mary Stavik heard the news, she collapsed, not from shock. She'd always believed this day would come, but from the sheer release of 28 years of tension. Her husband, Tom, was too ill to fully comprehend the development. His cognitive decline had accelerated in recent years, his body and mind worn down by decades of grief. Mary sat beside him in their living room and told him they got him, Tom. They finally got him. He nodded, tears streaming down his face, though whether he fully understood was unclear. He would die less than a year later, having lived just long enough to know his daughter's killer had a name. The investigation's final pieces fell into place rapidly once Base was in custody. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses, now armed with specific questions. A crucial testimony came from a woman named Kim Wagner, who'd been friends with Base in 1989. She come forward to police back then with concerns. Base had driven by her house late on the night. Mandy disappeared, acting strangely, his clothes muddy. Wagner had suggested police look at him more closely. Her statement had been documented, but not aggressively pursued. She'd carried guilt about that for nearly 30 years, wondering if she could have done more. Now, Wagner's testimony took on new significance. Other details emerged. Base had scratches on his hands and face in the days after Mandy's death, which he explained as work injury. His truck, a distinctive vehicle, had been seen near the area where Mandy's body was recovered. Individually, these were weak circumstantial detail. Combined with the DNA evidence, they formed a damning portrait. Base's defense attorneys argued the obvious. DNA evidence proved sexual contact, but not murder. Could Base and Mandy have had a consensual encounter? The argument was tenuous. Mandy had a steady boyfriend, no known connection to Base, and the brutality of her injury suggested extreme violence, not consensual intimacy gone wrong. But in a courtroom, doubt is the currency of defense, and the attorneys pressed every advantage. The prosecution assembled a case that was both scientifically sophisticated and emotionally devastating. They walked the jury through the genetic genealogy process, explaining how distant cousins and family trees had identified Base when traditional methods failed. They presented the DNA match, 1 in 1 trillion, and explained what that statistical certainty meant. They showed autopsy photos, described the injuries Mandy sustained, established a timeline that put Base in the right place at the right time, and they presented the human cost. Mandy's mother testified, now elderly and frail, her voice breaking as she described 3 decades of unanswered questions. Her younger brother, now middle-aged, described growing up in the shadow of his sister's murder. Friends from college testified about Mandy's dreams of becoming a teacher, her kindness towards struggling students, the future that had been stolen. The trial lasted 3 weeks in the spring of 2019. The courtroom in Whatcom County Superior Court was packed daily. Journalists, true crime enthusiasts, Acme residents who remembered Mandy or had known Base. The atmosphere was electric with a kind of collective catharsis. Decades of mystery condensing into a singular moment of reckoning. Base himself presented a puzzle. He maintained his innocence throughout, offering no explanation for how his DNA came to be on Mandy's body. His demeanor in court was flat, almost attached, prompting speculation about his psychological makeup. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the case suggested he might fall on the narcissistic or psychopathic spectrum, capable of compartmentalizing his crime, of living a double life without visible guilt, of believing he was clever enough to have gotten away with it forever. On May 24th, 2019, exactly 30 years to the day after Mandy disappeared. The jury returned a verdict: guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of first-degree rape. The courtroom erupted in muted gasps and quiet sobbing. Mary Stavik closed her eyes and whispered something that looked like a prayer. The judge scheduled sentencing for June. Bass was remanded to custody without bail as deputies led him from the courtroom. He glanced back once at his family, his wife and children sitting in the gallery, their faces blank with shock. Whatever he saw in their eyes made him look away quickly. The sentencing hearing in June 2019 was less about determining punishment. Washington state law mandated life without parole for aggravated first-degree murder, and more about bearing witness. It was a formal closure, a narrative that had stretched across 3 decades, and the courtroom became a space for competing stories about justice, mercy, and the meaning of Timothy Bass's life. The prosecution presented impact statements first. Mary Stavik, now 73, approached the podium with the aid of a cane. Her voice was thin but clear. "For 29 years, I've prayed for this day. Not because I want revenge, but because I needed to know. I needed Mandy's killer to face what he did. I needed the world to remember that my daughter was a person, not just a case file." She paused, gathering strength. Tim Bass took Mandy from us on a gray November day, but he also took every day after that. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone we should have celebrated. He took my granddaughter, the children Mandy would have had. He took Tom's last years, because the grief ate him alive. Tim Bass didn't just kill one. He's been killing us slowly for 30 years. Mandy's younger brother spoke next. He described growing up as the brother of the murdered girl, how that identity had shaped him in ways he was still processing. "I was 10 when Mandy died," he said. "I'm 40 now. I've spent 3/4 of my life without her, longer than I had her. And the hardest part isn't even the grief. It's the anger at how normal everything seemed, how the world just keeps going while we're frozen." In 1989, friends from college submitted written statements that were read aloud. Memories of Mandy tutoring children at a local elementary school during her volunteer hours. Her patience with a kindergartner who struggled to read. Her belief that education could change lives. The statements painted a portrait of profound loss. Not just a life ended, but vocation never fulfilled, impact never realized, a ripple effect of good that had been violently stopped. The defense presented a different narrative, not to excuse Bass's crime, but to add complexity to the picture. Bass's wife testified about their marriage, their children, his role as a father. She described a man who coached Little League, attended school functions, seemed devoted to his family. She wasn't denying his guilt. The DNA evidence made that impossible. But she was asserting that people are multitude, capable of being both monster and husband, killer and father. Bass's daughter, now in her 20s, submitted a letter asking the court for mercy in some undefined way, acknowledging the impossibility of her position. "I love my father, and I'm devastated by what he did. Those two things exist together in me, and I don't know how to reconcile them. I think about Mandy Stavik all the time now. I think about how she was just a few years older than me. I think about her family, and I can't even imagine their pain. But I also think about how I still need my dad, even though I hate what he did. I'm sorry that doesn't make sense." Nothing makes sense anymore. These testimonies revealed a terrible truth about violent crime. It creates multiple victim populations. Mandy's family had lost everything in the most direct way. But Bass's family had also been destroyed, their past rewritten, their memories poisoned, their future burdened with a legacy of violence they'd never chosen. The judge, a woman in her late 50s who presided over the trial with stern efficiency, took a moment before pronouncing sentence. "Mr. Bass," she began, looking directly at the defendant, "you've shown no remorse, offered no explanation, provided no closure beyond what science forced from you. You allowed Mandy Stavik's family to suffer for 3 decades while you lived freely among them. That cruelty compounds your original crime." She sentenced him to the mandatory term, life in prison without the possibility of parole. "You will die in custody, Mr. Bass. That is the consequence of your action. And while that may seem harsh to some, consider this. Mandy Stavik has been imprisoned in death for 30 years. Her family has been imprisoned in grief for 30 years. Your sentence is simply justice delayed." Bass was led from the courtroom. He walked with his head down, shoulders slumped, a man diminished. Outside, the media swarmed. Local news, national crime reporters, true crime podcasters who'd covered the case. The story had every element modern audiences craved. Small-town innocence, brutal violence, decades of mystery, cutting-edge forensic science, and finally, resolution. But for Acme, the resolution was complicated. The community had to grapple with the fact that they'd lived alongside a killer for decades, that their instinct about who belonged and who was dangerous had been so profoundly wrong. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. People wondered who else might be hiding in plain sight. What other secrets might the small town harbor? There was also a generational divide in how Bass's conviction was received. Older residents who'd known Mandy felt vindicated, relieved, grateful for persistence of investigators and the power of modern science. Younger residents, particularly those who'd been children in 1989, had a more conflicted response. They'd grown up with Tim Bass as a neighbor, a little league coach, a familiar face. The revelation forced them to reconsider their entire childhood, to wonder what predatory eyes might have watched them at baseball games or community events. Kim Wagner, the woman who'd reported her suspicions about Bass in 1989, gave an interview to a local newspaper. "I'm grateful he was caught," she said, "but I also carry this question. What if police had listened to me more seriously back then? What if they pursued it harder? Could this have been solved in months instead of decades?" It was an impossible question, a counterfactual that the Stavik family surely contemplated in their darkest moment. The role of genetic genealogy in solving the case sparked national conversations about privacy, consent, and the power of DNA databases. Civil liberties advocates raise concern. People who submit DNA to ancestry websites don't necessarily consent to having their genetic information used to investigate distant relatives. The counterargument was equally strong. Violent criminals shouldn't be protected by the genetic privacy of distant cousins who have no knowledge of their crime. For investigators, the Stavik case became a blueprint. Cold case units across the country began submitting DNA profiles to genealogy databases, leading to dozens of arrests in decades-old murders and rapes. The technique that caught Timothy Bass was catching serial killers, child predators, and murderers who'd thought themselves safe behind the shield of time. In November 2019, on the 30th anniversary of Mandy's death, a memorial service was held at the high school in Acme. Mary Stavik attended, accompanied by Mandy's siblings and a crowd of several hundred community members. The service was different from previous memorials. There was grief, certainly, but also a sense of completion. Mandy's story had an ending now. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted. She was still dead, her potential still unfulfilled, but the unknown killer had become a known convict. The question mark had become a period. A high school student who'd been assigned to research the case for a local history project spoke at the service. She was 17, close to Mandy's age when she died. "I never knew Mandy Stavik," the girl said, "but I've walked the road she ran. I've sat in classrooms where she sat. I've felt what it's like to be a young woman in a small town, trusting that your community will keep you safe. Her death changed this place forever, but her memory also reminds us what we should protect. The right to run freely, to move through the world without fear, to trust our neighbors. We can't give that back to man, but we can honor it by building a safer world for everyone who comes after." Mary Stavik later said the service gave her a kind of peace she hadn't expected. For so long, Mandy was just the murdered girl, Mary reflected. Her whole identity got reduced to how she died. But hearing people talk about who she was, her dreams, her kindness, her potential, it felt like she was a person again, not just a tragedy. In the years following Bass's conviction, the Stavik family began the slow process of rebuilding their lives around the absence they'd carried for 3 decades. It wasn't healing. Grief of that magnitude doesn't heal in any conventional sense, but it was transformation. The sharp, desperate quality of not knowing had dulled into the ache of knowing. Mary Stavik started visiting Mandy's grave more frequently, not out of ritual obligation, but because it had become a place of conversation rather than torment. She would sit on the grass beside the headstone and talk about her day, about her grandchildren, about the raspberries growing wild along the fence line. Ordinary things that had felt forbidden when justice remained unserved. Mandy's younger sister, who'd been just 8 years old in 1989, began writing a memoir about growing up in the aftermath of murder. She described the particular loneliness of being a secondary victim, grieving not just for her sister, but for the childhood that had been stolen, for parents who became hollow versions of themselves, for a family that functioned but never fully lived. "People would ask me about Mandy," she wrote, "and I'd tell them stories. But the truth is I barely remember her real voice anymore. I remember the memorial video voice. I remember what other people said about her. My actual memories of my sister have been overwritten by the mythology of her murder." The book, when it was published in 2021, sparked conversations about the long tail of violent crime, how trauma radiates outward and forward in time, affecting generations, shaping identity, creating inheritance patterns of pain. Readers who'd never experienced such loss found themselves understanding, perhaps for the first time, why families of cold case victims advocated so desperately for resources and attention. It wasn't just about one person's death. It was about dozens of people's lives, permanently altered, waiting in suspension until truth arrived. Timothy Bass, meanwhile, began serving his sentence at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Prison records indicated he was a model inmate, quiet, compliant, keeping largely to himself. He joined a Bible study group, though whether from genuine faith or strategic self-preservation was impossible to discern. He received occasional visits from his wife in the first year, but those tapered off. His children struggled with whether to maintain contact, torn between biological loyalty and moral revulsion. In 2020, a journalist specializing in criminal psychology requested an interview with Bass for a documentary about genetic genealogy and cold cases. Bass declined. He'd made no public statements since his conviction beyond a brief allocution at sentencing where he'd said, "I'm sorry for the pain," without specifying what pain or accepting responsibility for causing it. His silence was interpreted variously as shame, strategic legal maneuvering, preserving the possibility of appeal, or psychopathic indifference. Those who studied the case from a criminological perspective puzzled over his apparent lack of prior or subsequent violence. Bass had no criminal record before Mandy's murder and no evidence of crimes after. This didn't match the typical profile of a sexually motivated killer who generally escalate or repeat. One forensic psychologist theorized that Bass might have been what's called an opportunistic offender, someone without a deep-seated compulsion to violence, but who, under specific circumstances, intoxication, stress, opportunity, commits an act wildly out of character with their baseline behavior. Another theory suggested the murder had traumatized Bass himself, that the horror of what he'd done had shocked him into never repeating it. This psychological interpretation offered no exculpation. He'd still made the choice, still destroyed lives, but it complicated the narrative of the pure monster, suggesting instead a human capacity for evil that could exist in otherwise unremarkable people. The community of Acme continued its own process of reckoning. The town commissioned a memorial garden on the grounds of the high school, a quiet space with benches, native plants, and a stone marker bearing Mandy's name and the dates of her too short life. It was dedicated in 2020 and became a gathering place for runners who would start or end their routes there, a kind of reclamation of the activity that had been stolen from Mandy. The annual turkey trot, which had continued every Thanksgiving since 1989, despite the dark shadow over it, took on new meaning after Bass's conviction. Runners wore purple ribbons, Mandy's favorite color, and the event raised funds for scholarship in her name. Mary Stavik attended when her health allowed, standing at the starting line, watching hundreds of people run the roads her daughter had once run. "This is what justice looks like," she told a reporter. "Not just punishment for the guilty, but memory of innocent. Not just taking something away from him, but giving something back to her." The case also changed law enforcement practices regionally and nationally. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated cold case unit, funded partly through grants and partly through reallocation of resources. Detective Sharf, who'd broken the Stavik case, led the unit and trained other investigators in genetic genealogy technique. Within 3 years, they'd made arrests in 4 additional cold cases, murders and sexual assaults from the 1970s through the 1990s, crimes committed by people who thought themselves safely anonymous. The Washington state legislature passed a law in 2021 requiring mandatory DNA collection from all felony arrestees, not just convicts, expanding the database and increasing the chances of linking evidence to suspects. Civil liberties groups challenged the law, arguing it violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. The courts eventually upheld it with restriction, ruling that DNA profiles could be retained only if the arrest led to conviction. The debate illuminated tensions between public safety and individual privacy that had no easy resolution. Other cold case families in Washington began reaching out to the Staviks, seeking advice, hope, strategy. Mary Stavik became an inadvertent advocate, speaking at conferences for victim services organizations, testifying before legislative committees about the need for cold case resources. She was careful never to claim special wisdom. "I'm just a mother who waited," she'd say. But her presence was powerful. She embodied endurance, the refusal to let time erase truth. In 2022, a true crime documentary titled The Runner and the River premiered on a major streaming platform. It told Mandy's story with sensitivity, focusing less on the lurid details of crime and more on the investigative process, the scientific breakthrough, and the human cost. The Stavik family participated, granting interviews and access to home videos of Mandy from before her death, footage of birthday parties, high school graduation, Mandy playing with her dog Kyra. The documentary ended with footage from the memorial garden. Mary Stavik sitting on a bench in autumn light, leaves falling around her. She spoke directly to the camera. "People ask me if I have closure now. I tell them closure is a word people use when they don't understand grief. Mandy is still gone. I still wake up some mornings and forget for a moment. Think I need to call her? And then remember, that never changes. What changed is that I stopped living in a question. I stopped wondering who and why and how. I can remember Mandy now without that wondering eating me alive. That's not closure. That's just piece adjacent. And after 30 years, I'll take it. The documentary was viewed by millions, becoming part of the cultural conversation about cold cases, forensic science, and the nature of justice. It won awards for its treatment of victim family, for centering their humanity rather than sensationalizing their pain. Younger viewers who discovered Mandy's story through the documentary often commented on how normal she seemed, how she could have been their sister, their classmate, themselves. This ordinariness was precisely the point. Violence doesn't discriminate, doesn't only target those living in obvious danger. Mandy had done everything right, stayed in her hometown, ran in daylight, carried protection in the form of her dog, and still became prey. In 2023, Timothy Bass filed a post-conviction relief petition, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel. The motion claimed his defense attorneys should have fought harder to suppress the DNA evidence on Fourth Amendment grounds. Legal experts gave the petition almost no chance of success. The DNA collection had been lawful, the match irrefutable, but it demonstrated Bass's continued refusal to accept responsibility. The motion was denied within 6 months. Mary Stavik's health began declining in late 2023. She'd battled cancer twice in the years following Bass's conviction, each time surprising doctors with her resilience. "I had to live long enough to see him convicted," she told her oncologist. "After that, my body could rest." By early 2024, it was clear the cancer had returned aggressively. She entered hospice care in March. Her children gathered around her bed in the house where Mandy had grown up, where her room still existed largely unchanged. In her final days, Mary spoke frequently about both her daughters, the one who'd survived and built a life, and the one who'd been taken. She expressed no regrets about the decades spent advocating for justice, no bitterness about the time lost to grief. "I got to know who killed my daughter," she whispered to her surviving daughter. "Most mothers don't get that. I'm grateful." Mary Stavik died on April 18, 2024, with her family surrounding her. She was 77 years old, 34 years older than Mandy had been at death. In her obituary, the family requested that donations be made to the cold case unit of the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office or to the Scholarship Fund in Mandy's name. Hundreds attended her funeral. Detective Scharf gave a eulogy, his voice breaking. "She taught me that justice isn't just about catching criminals. It's about honoring victims by refusing to forget them." Mary was buried beside her husband Tom, and not far from Mandy's grave. The three of them together again, a family reunited in death in ways they couldn't be in life. In the months following Mary's death, people who followed the case left flowers at the memorial garden, posted tributes online, shared memories of how the Stavik family's dignity had affected them. The case had become more than a murder investigation. It had become a testament to persistence, to the power of loving the dead by seeking truth about their death. The technology that solved Mandy's case continued evolving. By 2024, genetic genealogy had helped solve hundreds of cold cases nationwide. The technique was being refined, made faster and more cost-effective. But with each success came renewed ethical questions. Who owned DNA information once it entered public databases? Could police use these techniques without warrants? Where was the line between public safety and genetic surveillance? These debates were important, complex, and ongoing. But for families like the Staviks, the abstract arguments faded beside the concrete reality. Their loved one's killer had been caught, convicted, imprisoned. The science had delivered what decades of conventional investigation could. Whatever the policy implications, that truth remained. In November 2024, on the 35th anniversary of Mandy's death, the community of Acme held a quiet memorial service. Fewer people attended than in previous years. Some had moved away. Others had died. Younger generations had different touchstones. But those who came stood in the cold November air, so similar to the day Mandy disappeared, and spoke her name. They shared stories. They remembered not just how she died, but how she lived. The bright young woman who wanted to teach children, who ran with joy, who trusted her community and was betrayed by one of its members. A former classmate of Mandy's, now in her 50s, spoke about the lasting impact. "We were all so young when it happened. We thought we were immortal. Mandy's death taught us we weren't. But it also taught us something else, that communities can survive trauma if they refuse to let it define them. Acme isn't that murder town anymore. We're the town that remembered, that fought for justice, that never gave up. Mandy's legacy isn't her death. It's what we did after." The case files for Amanda Stavik's murder were officially closed in 2019 following Bass's conviction, but they remain symbolically open in the broader narrative of American crime and justice. Her case was taught in forensic science programs as an example of genetic genealogy's power. It was cited in victim advocacy circles as proof that cold cases deserve resources and attention. It was referenced in legislative debates about DNA databases and criminal justice funding. And in homes across America, people who'd never met Mandy Stavik or walked the roads of Acme, Washington, knew her story. They watched the documentary, listened to the podcast, read the article. They saw in her something universal: the vulnerability of innocence, the randomness of violence, the importance of persistence when the world moves on from tragedy. For true crime audiences, Mandy's case offers a rare complete arc: mystery, investigation, revelation, justice. So many cold cases remain unsolved, their narrative suspended in permanent uncertainty. Mandy's story had an ending, even if it came 3 decades late. That completion was both satisfying and deeply sad. Satisfying because justice was served, sad because it took so long, because the victim never knew her killer would be caught, because the family spent the majority of their lives in anguish. Timothy Bass, now in his late 50s, continued serving his sentence with decades ahead of him before natural death would arrive. Prison records indicated he'd gained weight, developed diabetes, aged in the accelerated way that incarcerated people do. He rarely received visitors. His children had largely cut contact, unwilling or unable to maintain relationships with a father revealed as a murderer. His wife divorced him in 2021, remarrying 2 years later, attempting to build a life free from the shadow of his crime. In prison interviews conducted by psychologists studying violent offenders, Bass remained largely uncommunicative about his inner life. He completed questionnaires, participated in mandatory programs, but offered no insight into what drove him to kill Mandy Stavik. Was it premeditated or impulsive? Had he known her better than he'd admitted? Was there sexual obsession, random opportunity, or some psychological break that occurred that November day? These questions would likely never be answered. Bass's silence denied even the inadequate comfort of understanding. The family couldn't know why Mandy specifically, why that day, why such brutality. They could only know who, and that he would never be free again. Sometimes that had to be enough. In the end, Amanda Stavik's story is not really about murder, though murder is how it begins and ends. It's about time, how it passes differently for those who wait for justice versus those who walk free despite their crime. It's about science, how human ingenuity can reach backward through decades to touch evidence long thought useless, transforming it into testimony. It's about community, how small towns metabolize tragedy, how neighbors look at each other differently when trust is violated from within. Most fundamentally, it's about memory, about refusing to let the dead become statistics. Data point: cold files and basement archives. Mary Stavik spent 30 years keeping her daughter present, keeping her name spoken, her face remembered, her humanity centered in every conversation about the case. That fierce maternal love became a form of resistance against time's erasure. The technology that caught Timothy Bass was remarkable, revolutionary even, but technology alone didn't solve the case. Human persistence did. Detectives who refused to quit, scientists who pushed forensic boundaries, a mother who wouldn't let the world forget. The DNA was always there, waiting in a freezer. What changed was human determination to look at it again differently, with new tools and old commitment. This case reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice waiting for its moment, gathering strength, building inevitable momentum. The delay is cruel. The Stavik family lost decades to not knowing, and Tom Stavik died just months after finally learning his daughter's killer's name. That timing was brutally unfair. But the alternative, never knowing, die with the question unanswered, would have been even worse. We live in an era of unprecedented surveillance, where our genetic information, our digital footprints, our movements and purchases and relationships create data trails we don't fully understand or control. This raises legitimate fears about privacy, about government overreach, about the potential for abuse, but also creates possibilities for justice that previous generations couldn't imagine. The same databases that can trace your ancestry can trace a killer's genealogy. The same technology that satisfies curiosity about ethnic heritage can end decades of family anguish. Finding the balance between these competing values, safety and privacy, justice and liberty, is one of the defining challenges of modern society. Mandy Stavik's case doesn't resolve that tension, but it illustrates what's at stake on both sides: the right to genetic privacy and the right to know who murdered your child. For those who remain in Acme, Washington, life continues in the way life always does, with births and deaths, celebrations and ordinary days, the small dramas of small-town existence. But there's a before and after quality to the town's history now. Before Mandy, after justice. The memorial garden remains. The scholarship continues. Her name appears on the honor roll of students who embody kindness and promise. And on certain November days, when the light slants gray and cold, when the wind moves through bare trees and the river runs high, people in Acme still think of the girl who went running and never came home. They think of her not with the sharp grief of early loss, but with the softer sadness of long remembrance. They think of what she might have been, the teacher she would have become, the children she would have inspired, the ordinary, beautiful life she deserved. They think, too, of the man who took that from her, who walked among them for nearly 3 decades pretending innocence. They think of how easy it is to hide behind a familiar face, how monsters don't always look monstrous. They think of their own vulnerability, their children's vulnerability, the thin membrane between safety and violence. But mostly, they think of memory as an act of love. As long as Mandy Stavik is remembered, not just as a victim, but as a person, a daughter, a runner who loved her dog and dreamed of teaching kindergarten, then something of her persists beyond the crime. Death took her body. Time threatened to take her story. But memory, fierce and determined, kept her present. Justice may come late, may arrive with agonizing slowness, may require technologies not yet invented when the crime occurred. But if the living refuse to forget the dead, if communities demand accountability, if science serves truth, then even the coldest case can come warm to the touch. Even the darkest mystery can resolve into light. Amanda Teresa Stavik ran into the gray November afternoon 35 years ago. She never made a home to her family, but through decades of love, persistence, and faith in eventual truth, she found her way to justice. And in the end, perhaps that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered, to be loved beyond death, to have someone refuse to let the world forget our name. Rest in peace, Mandy. Your run is finally over. You can rest now.